Well, thank you very much for your opening remarks, Deputy Director General Gonzalez. You really gave us a flying start for this super TFA anniversary event. Ladies and gentlemen, good morning, good afternoon, and even good evening from wherever you are watching us. My name is Erik Solberg, and I will be the moderator for the first session of this event that is called Measuring the Impact of the 5 years of TFA Implementation. I really look forward to it. Thank you very much for taking part in this anniversary event for the Trade Facilitation Agreement. We have put together a broad program of the whole day, and before you ask, the presentation will be available on the dedicated webpage of the WTO website. Please use them as a door opener for the fascinating world of trade facilitation. To me personally, trade facilitation is the absolute core issue for the WTO. To facilitate and foster cross-border trade so it can flourish and benefit all. I'd like to all to quietly say the words trade facilitation. At least to me, the words sound and taste like candy. To help me tell you how sweet the candy is, I have a fantastic panel of speakers representing stakeholders and researchers joining me here on stage and online, who will carry out a stock take of the TFA after its first 5 years of implementation. Let me introduce them to you. To my right, Silvia Sorescu. She's an economist, policy analyst, emerging policy issue division, trade and agriculture directorate of the OECD. Trade facilitation around the world, state of play, and economic impacts. To my left, far left, Roberta Piemandini, counselor at the Economic Research and Statistics Division of the World Trade Organization. To my right, William Gain. He's the global lead of the trade facilitation in the custom reform and border management part of the World Bank Group. Welcome, Bill. And left, Cosimo Beverly. He's the research economist from the Economic Research and Statistics Division of the World Trade Organization. I'd also like to welcome online, Kuhn Burden, Executive Director, International Affairs of European Federation of Pharmaceutical Industries and Associations. We welcome all of you. You can find much more about their extensive experience through their bios on the event webpage. After listening to the presentation, we will have some time for questions and answers, both from the floor and online on Zoom. But please note that this will only be in audio. We will not see your faces on the video, unfortunately. And secondly, to respect the time allocated for all speakers, we kindly ask that the interventions are limited to no more than 7 minutes. And I'll be tough on that. Thank you very much for understanding. First, I'd like to give the floor to Silvia Sorescu from OECD. So Silvia, how sweet is the candy?
Thank you very much for this kind introduction, and good morning to everyone here in the room, as well as good afternoon and good evening to anyone who may be connecting from other time zones. And thank you very much to WTO DG Gonzalez for the excellent introduction, and already I think setting the stage in a great way with the 5 points that you made that I hope will also resonate in the presentation that I will try to give right now through some of the research that we have been doing at the OECD in seeing where we are right now in 2022 after 5 years of implementation, but also to provide maybe some further thoughts of where further implementation efforts could maybe focus in the upcoming years. Thank you so much. So through the 3 points that I'll try to go through in the next couple of minutes, I basically want to echo as well what already has been said in the introduction. That trade facilitation has been and really remains key to help us address currently also some of the supply chain disruptions that we see and that do have an impact on the trade costs and uncertainties that both firms and consumers face across the world around all sectors. So I'll try to focus on 3 things. where we are right now, where is the progress that we see that is taking place across different regions around the world through the tool that we have developed at the OECD in close cooperation as well with the WTO colleagues. That is the OECD Trade Facilitation Indicators, and the try to provide a mapping of where we sit today in relation to the TFA, but also broader measures that link to trade facilitation. Also try to map out what are the multidimensional benefits that we see also from the impacts that we try to look at using the indicators. And I think my colleagues from the WTO will also delve into these further in their presentation. And then just wrap up with where are the challenges that we see now and how can we start addressing these in the next years. Can go to the next slide, please. The following one. So where we are today, and then through the trade facilitation indicators, we try to track the different areas that are covered by the TFA, going from transparency, but also other areas of predictability, looking at issues around automation tools for trade facilitation, streamlining of procedures, and border agency cooperation, as was highlighted by DDG Gonzalez, is a very important point that the TFA covers through the national trade facilitation committees. And the good news is that we do see through the latest series that progress is happening all around the world. So looking back at the 2017 series when the TFA entered into force and where we stand today, we see that progress is happening throughout all regions that the trade facilitation indicators cover and throughout all these different areas. So that is definitely good news for where we are today. We go to the next slide, please. What we do try to look at as well is how to distinguish between the implementation of regulatory frameworks for trade facilitation and operational practices. And we see, again, through the TFIs, that most of the progress that has been happening throughout all these different areas from transparency, streamlining of procedures, border agency cooperation, we see that most advances are in putting these regulatory frameworks into place. And we believe that this is what has also helped with the TFA implementation over these recent years. And again, this is something that we see throughout all income groups, throughout all regions that we cover with the indicators. If we could go to the next slide. And through our latest data set for 21-22, we also tried to dig deeper into some of the different areas. And we do see again, and it was also already highlighted in the introduction as being very important in terms of supporting the digitalization of processes, is that we do observe again throughout the different tools that the TFA provides in terms of facilitating trade, that it does indeed support the digitalization of trade processes. And this goes from areas around pre-arrival clearance to measures for authorized operators, expedited shipments, but also in some areas that have to do with perishable goods. So again, there is progress that is being made there. And the key highlight to take away from this chart is the green bars that allows us to see the progress that is being made throughout the different areas. If we can go to the next slide, please, and the following one. I wanted to highlight in the second part, what are some of the multidimensional benefits of trade facilitation? And as DDG Gonzalez was highlighting very well, these are many. So these have to start, of course, with looking at what we see in terms of trade costs and trade flows. And again, the key takeaway from the chart that you have here is that we indeed see a correlation between where countries stand in terms of their average trade facilitation performance and trade costs. So the better you are, the most trade facilitation measures that you have in place, the lower your trade costs would be. And again, I think my WTO colleagues will delve into these a bit deeper. But again, another good news and a reason to strengthen these efforts for further progress. If we go to the next slide, please. I also wanted to highlight the point linking trade facilitation to inclusiveness. And we have tried to look at what are the benefits for SMEs. Again, linking the trade facilitation indicators with how SMEs around the world are integrating into international markets, both through exports and both through imports. And again, what we see here is that improving trade facilitation around the different areas does allow SMEs to further integrate into international markets. And it even increases this probability for them to export by around 3%. And specifically looking at areas of automation and streamlining of procedures, we then observe there really important benefits and potential benefits going higher from, again, improving these trade facilitation areas. And we note through our work that this could raise exports of SMEs by between 4.5 and 6.5%. And trade facilitation also matters a lot for the digital age. And again, through our work, we see that this can enhance parcel exports around the different countries in the world. So just to wrap up, if we can go to the next slide and the following one, just really to close with some thoughts going forward and where maybe we think that some of the efforts could concentrate to better close the gaps that we see in this implementation of regulatory frameworks and operational practices. And if we disaggregate the information that we can get through the trade facilitation indicators for these two areas, we observe that this gap is still significant across some regions. So there is effort not just to allow traders to do pre-arrival clearance or to obtain certification to be an authorized operator, but also how to make sure that these types of processes cover the widest number of transactions possible and in the smoothest way possible as well. And just wrapping up with the next slide, which I think links also very well to what Didi Gonzalez was mentioning in terms of how trade facilitation can help us with cooperation around the world, starting from within countries, but then going between countries. And again, I think the TFA does provide several important tools to do so, particularly in this area of cross-border agency cooperation. And we see through the trade facilitation indicators that this remains the most challenging. So there is probably a lot of scope to continue focusing in this area so as to enhance cooperation, make sure that this can support resilience and focus on some areas that can support risk management, cooperation, the implementation of national trade facilitation committees. And while there is a good news that we see some green in the bars that you have in the charts here, much more can be done. So I would like to wrap up here and thank you very much for the opportunity to be here with you today and looking forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Sylvia, for highlighting the TFA implementation progress in various areas, for multidimensional benefits it brings and the challenges that need to be addressed in operational practices. You have a slightly according to time. With that, I would like to give the floor to Roberta Piermentini and Cosimo Borelli from the WTO Secretariat. Welcome. You have the floor.
So good morning. Thank you for the invitation. I like today to present some of the research we have been doing at the WTO. We did back in 2015 in the World Trade Report in 2015, the first comprehensive and detailed review of the impact of the trade facilitation agreement. And today, what we are going to present, Cosimo and I, is some studies that we have been working on since 2015 that are much more specific in kind. In particular, I will, next slide, please. I will look at what has, can you go back, please? One slide. Okay. In particular, we present four studies. One on the impact of the trade facilitation on trade costs, another one on the impact of trade facilitation on small versus large firm, a third study on the impact on tariff evasion, and a fourth study on the impact of specifically of the pre-shipment inspections on trade. So let me start with the trade cost. So the WTO, we have recently developed a new index, WTO Trade Cost Index, This is a measure of overall trade frictions and is sort of calculated comparing international trade costs with domestic trade costs. We have decomposed this index into its main drivers, 4 main drivers: transport and travel cost, information and transaction costs, trade policy costs, and governance. And what we have done in particular in this study is to look at in the section on trade policy costs to focus on a trade facilitation. And to do that, we have used the OECD Trade Facilitation Index that allows us to specifically identify the role that potential role that trade facilitation agreement can have on in explaining differences in trade costs, because it actually maps. It is constructed on the provisions based on the provisions of the trade facilitation agreements. Please, next slide. So in this chart, what you see is the breakdown of total trade cost into their components. And if you look at the blue bar, what that shows you is the contribution that the lack of investment in trade facilitation has on overall trade costs. And what you get is a sense of the importance in investment in trade facilitation compared to other policies and other formal investments. And what you find is that on average, trade facilitation, matters for 1.5 times more than tariffs. But specifically for high income countries, that is even more relevant in explaining differences across trade costs. And that's given, for example, the fact that tariffs are lower. So somehow these underline the relevance for of trade costs due to the lack of trade facilitation compared to other trade costs, and their importance compared to moving on the opening up with tariff removal, for example. A large share, you may say, okay, that's not much, right? But that's a large share of what you can do with trade policy. Largely and when you look specifically at the trade facilitation agreement, a large share of trade cost is actually due to infrastructure, transport, travel and communication costs. So it's more to do in a sense with a wider definition of trade facilitation that involve investment in infrastructure. So moving to the second study that we look at, please, next slide. So what we look in this study, this is a study I worked on with Professor Lionel Fontanier and Gianluca Orefice. And in this study, what we have information on export at the level of firm. We look at French firms and we relate firms' export to their performance and with firms' export performance to the market conditions, entry market conditions in the importing countries. What do we learn? That trade facilitation has different effect on small and large firms. We know that trade facilitation provisions on information availability increase trade for all firms, large and small firms. Trade facilitation provisions on advanced ruling, appeal procedure, and automation increase trade for large and medium firms and not for small firms. So in a way, when we look at that, we were very surprised by these results. In a way, we are not able to identify the full gains. We're not able to identify gains. So in terms of trade for small firms due to some form of the provisions. Now we advance a number of hypotheses in this study. One of them being the lack of competition in the shipping industries and pointing at the importance of number of complementary policies to make sure that all gains from trade facilitation are acquired. And I leave it here. I give the floor to Cosimo to present the other two studies, and we'll be happy to answer to your questions.
Conducted the study together with Roy Tiku, recently published in 2022 on the role of trade facilitation in reducing tariff evasion. Annabelle was referring to this important function of trade facilitation. We find that simplifying customs procedures indeed reduce tariff evasion, and in particular via advanced rulings and appeal procedures, and with the effects being stronger in countries with weaker control of corruption. Next slide, please. We are also conducting a study with, together with Lionel Fontanier, Gianluca Refice, Alexander Keck, and Martin Brammel, about the trade impact of pre-shipment inspection. So you might know that pre-shipment inspection is disciplined by in Article 10.5 of the TFA, and that it is the second TFA article in terms of proportion of category A commitments. More than 80% of countries committed on Article 10.5. We show that the removal of PSI requirements boosts bilateral imports by 4.9%. This is due to a reduction in trade costs, but at the same time, trade in food and SPS intensive products is facilitated by PSI because it tends to provide information. So there's this dual role of pre-shipment inspection, both as a trade cost increasing measure and as an information provision measure. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Robert and Cosimo, for this interesting presentation and presenting your research with us. So just let me point to a few takeaways. First, the custom obstacles explained between 3 and 9% of the variation of the trade costs. 2, large firms in general gain more from TF than small firms. 3, trade facilitation moderates tariff evasion, especially in countries with weaker institutions. And 4, the removal of pre-ship inspections requirements boost trade by reducing trade costs. But on the other hand, pre-ship inspections increase trade in food and SPS intensive products by providing information. Okay, and I'll give the floor to Mr. William Gain from the World Bank Group. Will, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Chair, and hello to everybody. It's an absolute pleasure to be back in Geneva in person, and I really look forward to an exciting day. DG Gonzalez, your remarks again were very insightful, and I'll pick up a few of them as I move through my presentation. Is it up? It's coming. There we are. Excellent. Next slide, please. And the next one. And the next one. The World Bank is a major provider of trade-related assistance, as many of you know, with covering a whole range of different types of assistance, including technical assistance, global advocacy, advisory services, financing of major trade-related infrastructure, and our data-driven studies and indexes, including research around the Logistics Performance Index and our upcoming Business Environment Index, which will be coming in the future. Next slide, please. Our flagship program around supporting countries to implement the Trade Facilitation Agreement is our Trade Facilitation Support Program, launched in 2014 and supported by 9 donor partners: Australia, Canada, European Union, the Netherlands, Norway, Sweden, Switzerland, the UK, and the United States. It provides technical assistance and knowledge sharing to countries implementing the Trade Facilitation Agreement, both WTO members and non-members and accession countries alike. Next slide, please. What we've seen is exponential demand across countries since inception of the program, and you'll see there just a few metrics in terms of where the demand comes from and the most that we're seeing. Risk management, 30 countries, 15 countries around the time release studies, which I'll talk more about as a baseline. Authorized operator leading to authorized economic operator, trade information portals, so increasing transparency, predictability and access to information, and of course, preparation and moving towards a single window. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. So measuring impact, where can countries begin to think about this? Where can countries begin to implement and hardwire into their programs, measuring and evaluating the trade facilitation agreement implementation? What's important is to begin with a baseline. The time release study provides one very good option around measuring how long it takes to import, export, and transit. And it's important to do this on a regular basis, along with analytics, diagnostics, and validation of what is coming from the data. So it's operationally validated, and then pairing that with change management. So trade facilitation implementation is not just about moving goods, it's about efficiency, and that requires change, and change requires support for people. And then implementing the change reforms and measuring what that means in terms of alignment with the trade facilitation agreement. And then more importantly, to ensure that it's communicated to the private sector and that it's felt by the private sector. Next slide, please. So through our program, we've developed an alignment tracking tool, which shows how the reforms from the baseline to the current day have increased alignment with the trade facilitation agreement overall. And you'll see that across the portfolio of 50 or so countries, we're seeing a direct increase from 41 to 51% in terms of overall alignment. This tracking looks at 3 dimensions, looks at the policy and legal provisions that might be in place. It looks at the operational implementation of that policy or legislation. And then it also looks at how it's felt by the private sector. And we heard from the OECD during Sylvia's presentation that, the increase in alignment correlates with a reduction in trade costs. Next slide, please. We've also developed what we call our private sector savings methodology, and it's been developed through our trade research unit within the World Bank, and they indicate that full and effective implementation of the trade facilitation agreement will accrue $210 billion per annum in savings to the private sector. The model is kind of described there, but essentially it's about what traders would pay. And it's between 0.6 and 2.1% ad valorem on average for each day of time. And you'll see that roughly it's 1% reduction. And you'll see this kind of like a little bit more information there. But essentially, it's what the private sector will see and what they will feel from seeing the implementation of the trade facilitation agreement. Next slide, please. So a few examples. The model's fine, but what does it look like once we implement? So I've got 3 good examples there. Work we've undertaken in the Caribbean through the implementation of border collaboration, coordination, and automation, a total of 5.7 million in savings for the private sector. 2 minutes to go. Good. South Asia. So regional project, Nepal, Bangladesh, with total saving of 61 million to the private sector across those land borders. So particularly impressive. And Timor-Leste, accession country to the WTO, again, reduction in 6 days through applying automation and efficiency at the port, and 5.5 million in private sector savings. Next slide, please. Cross-cutting mechanisms. I'll see I've just highlighted the NTFC is a particularly important leadership mechanism. Next slide, please. And enhancing transparency along with implementation reform through access to information. And we know that's particularly important for SMEs and women-owned, led and managed firms. Next slide, please. A couple of quick examples in the slides. I won't go through them, but in Tonga, expedited shipments allowed for a 3-hour window of pre-notice for the importation of vaccine. Next slide, please. Kyrgyz Republic, TRS and reforms from that implemented reduced time to import from 20 hours to 9. Next slide, please. And this is one of our favorites, reduced the time from 10 hours to 15 minutes across the Guatemala-Honduras border by implementing a pilot processes. Next slide, please. And the next one. Yep. And finally, just cementing impact, scaling up, acceleration, building upon success, leveraging digitization, building resilience for the future with the corresponding necessary sharing of lessons and learning across both national agencies, regional institutions, and at the global level. Thanks. I think that's the final slide. Thank you very much.
Thank you very, very much, Will. And thank you for covering as many aspects in that short time of measuring the impact of the TFA implementation and for providing concrete examples. I really like them. I really did, of where it has made a market difference. Let me now turn to our guest online, Mr. Koen Burden from the European Federation of Pharmaceutical Industries and Associations. Come on, Koen, you're welcome.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you today. Thank you, Deputy DG Gonzalez, for your, I think, very important opening remarks. The 5 points are well taken. And I'm very happy to be here representing FPA. FPA is the European Federation of Pharmaceutical Industries and Associations in Europe, representing 36 national associations, but also leading pharmaceutical companies and hundreds of SMEs. So it's a very diverse sort of membership that I represent here. And I'd like to focus on some of the practical aspects and points from an industry perspective. I should also maybe say that for me, this is particularly special, given the fact that I worked previously as director at the World Trade Institute on the Trade Facilitation Agreement, as well as Trade and Sustainable Development and Unilateral Tariff Dismantling. So this is great to be here with you. Let me go through a few points that I'd like to raise. Can I share my own screen, please, with the presentation? Yeah. Thank you. So maybe the first thing is that indeed the primary goal of trade facilitation is very clear. And from an industry perspective, when we talk about tariffs, we also talk more about, and that was illustrated by previous speakers, about customs checks. The cost for industry from the red tape and time lost are often much higher than the tariff costs imposed. And that's what previous speakers have already said. So I'd like to confirm that. For the pharmaceutical industry, there is a bit of a special situation because you have the WTO 040 agreement, which has not been updated since 2010, but that makes tariffs relatively less important as for other industries, other sectors. The fact that we have no tariffs on many medicines is very important. But maybe good to remind everyone that, of course, it's not countries that export or import, even though I said that for many years as an international trade economist, but companies export and import. And a lot of this is intermediate trade. One of the things that I want to emphasize here is that when you look at the practice of exports and imports, if you talk about, for example, the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine, it has 280 components created in 87 factories in 19 countries. So when at the border, one of those ingredients is held up or stopped or delayed, that impacts 279 other ingredients as well. That cumulative effect, I find sometimes being slightly underemphasized in sort of the complexity that is currently there when producing, in this case, for example, vaccines. And I have a bit of now noise. Maybe we can go on mute. For monoclonal antibody treatments, that's even stronger, where you have 550 ingredients and components. So some of the previous points mentioned by previous speakers, we would fully concur with. It facilitates cross-border trade, but without compromising safety and security. For companies, it also reduces uncertainty in terms of the reliability of trade flows, leaving one place, getting to another place in time. And the question I always have is how you measure that level of uncertainty. The second point, increase the size of the market by decreasing barriers and market fragmentation. when you look at the scale of global production for a global industry, the more integrated markets are, the easier it is to work with them and to have the necessary demand for the scaled production that is needed. So trade facilitation has a market size effect in terms of integration that should not be underestimated. And the final point mentioned by previous speakers is the increased flexibility and resilience. But maybe for 1 second, the increased resilience in case of, for example, a pandemic emergency like we have just faced, it relates to finding fast alternative sources of energy, of supply, and reduce dependencies. But in a pharmaceutical setting, it also means you have to be fast in terms of regulatory approvals. Because if you change an ingredient, you need to obtain new regulatory approvals. So that sort of flexibility and resilience is where the trade facilitation agreement would go hand in hand with regulatory collaboration. Given time, I'll go through a few points a bit faster. Who saw the COVID-19 crisis come in December 2019, or in February, the war in Ukraine? It disrupts global supply chains. So I think what is key is that without knowing a certain future, we have tools that enable us to be as flexible and agile as possible. And the trade facilitation agreement is one of those. So are these good or bad crises? A crisis is always bad, but if we learn from it, if we learn lessons, it's important to prepare. We see here the IFP made 5 steps during the pandemic to urgently advance vaccine equity. One important priority was to call out trade barriers to be eliminated. And on the right, you see actually the point raised, which is what the trade facilitation agreement in part contributes to, eliminating trade barriers, also export restrictions. That's really important. We saw import facilitation, but also export restrictions that were not helpful for global distribution, and to adopt policies that expedite cross-border supply of key essential manufacturing materials. The other key element is to drive further innovation, for which intellectual property is essential. I'm going to skip this, this slide. No, actually not this one. The example I illustrate here is a very practical one. When the pandemic hit, there were lockdowns in the beginning in March, April, May 2020. That meant that some of the products that were exported from Europe to some countries, for example, in Africa, were halted because they did not have the proper customs papers and sort of documents in order to be importing these products into some of the countries that were the destinations. The reason for that was that embassies were closed, consulates were closed to get the necessary paperwork done. Our industry thought, well, this is about medicine, so everybody will understand the vital need for the export of medicines, but that was not the case. So some of the ships were turned back. What you see is that nobody could have predicted that. It went so fast that when you have a digital customs procedure system, or the TFA implementation, and that's why I fully support previous speakers on digitalization of customs procedures, are in place, you have all these advantages: back traceability, simplification of audits, cost efficiency, reduction of paper loss, harmonization of data. So the current trend that we're watching, that some countries are thinking of going back to paper-based procedures, is not something we would support. So this is a very concrete example of where the trade facilitation agreement is incredibly important and helps agility, even though we don't know what crisis comes next. I'm going to leave this one for time and conclude with my last slide. So industry is a real strong supporter of the trade facilitation agreement because it matters for exports and imports, and not just for final goods exports and imports, but for all those parts and components and intermediate inputs that are being traded. If you have 280 components, it takes only one component to be delayed to have a problem in the supply chain. And the industry really welcomes the progress also made over the past 5 years that we celebrate at this event. From an industry perspective, it's also important to say that countries that implement the TFA more strongly in practice are more attractive for industry activities and investments, because uncertainty is reduced and trade facilitation is more guaranteed as part of a global supply chain.
Koen, I'm sorry, but I think you have to finish up now.
Yes, I finish. I finish now. So there are a few steps beyond monitoring that we really like to see being implemented. It's building best practices in national trade facilitation committees, continued digitization, sharing of customs data, and indeed focusing on the implementation of the commitments going forward. A more ambitious trade and health commitment is still welcomed by industry. So this is, we are at a great moment today, but we hope to be back in 10 years and see again further progress to support future pandemic preparedness. We also asked
Thank you
for an
very,
update
very
on the
much,
zero for
Koen.
zero
I
agreement
just have to
and
cut
keen
you
to
off
participate and
time
engage to
reasons.
provide inputs on the ground for government industry platforms. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and sorry for interrupting you, Koen. But thank you very much for sharing with us the perspective of the industry, both the exporters, the importers, and the producers in regard to the implementation of the TFA. Well, we have now finished with the speakers. We now have the opportunity to listen to some of your questions. Given the time available, please make your questions brief to allow for more questions. And if you raise your hand on Zoom or in the room, we will give you the floor. The floor is open. United States, you got the floor.
Appreciate the speakers today and all the work, and very much welcome the participation of an actual trader like the guy that's online. Interesting that we heard from a lot of researchers this morning. I think our hope was we would see a few more people that actually trade here today, as I think it was quite correct to say that governments, researchers, the World Bank, none of them are actual traders, that we needed to hear the importers and exporters today so that we could really understand how the 5 years has impacted on the ground those that trade goods. Interesting to hear about PSI. I don't think that any of our experiences with our traders that we hear from on a daily basis reflects what actually was spoken of here this morning. Because in the research that we have and the conversations we have with our traders are that all traders are benefit from TFA implementation, and that there is not a lack of benefit to small and medium enterprises in the trade facilitation agreement, especially in that, I can understand, some idea that pre-arrival processing or maybe in advance rulings, that there is more response from large traders about how that affects them. But if there is merely implementation of Article 7 and Article 10, the reduction of formalities, express shipments, some of the greatest recipients are small and medium enterprises in low value shipments. That is all part of the expedited shipments article. So I think that I look forward to hearing a few more people that actually trade today for their experience. My feedback from our pharma companies, and actually everybody that we've been hearing from in the last year, more reflects what we've heard from the gentleman online. Yes, we've seen a great deal in growth in automation. Automation is the growth. When countries get rid of their consularization requirements, when they drop their consularization fees, when they get rid of paper documents, when they move towards e-invoicing, e-electronics, those are where the real gains are. And it doesn't matter what size of the company are, they're small or large, because once Customs does MFN and border agencies does MFN work, such as automating, that benefit applies to everybody. And they have the opportunity, then we have a whole growth in an industry where they provide the connectivity to these different customs services. So it is a scaled operation that's available to all traders. If you have some more insight about these areas, Article 10, Article 7 on Express that you've also done research in that shows how those reduction of formalities, those getting rid of tax, and where is the role of tax authorities from this morning's presentation? Because it's not only customs that collects money, it's the tax authorities. And for every time there's a customs declaration, there's a tax invoice. So where is that in the conversation today?
Thank you very much, US. I think we'll touch upon some of your remarks a little bit later this day. I give the floor to Ecuador, please.
Thank you very much. First of all, thank you to all the presenters. The information that you have shared has been very insightful. I have three very short questions. The first one to Mrs. Sorescu from OECD. When you mentioned about the gaps between regulatory framework and operational practices, I would like to know what would be the suggestions to close these gaps and if technical capacity has something to do with the existing gaps. The second one to our colleagues from WTO, thank you very much for your research. And I was also intrigued by the outcome and the benefits from small companies. But I was thinking if this is related to the production capacity. Given that large companies can respond to higher demand faster than a small company, maybe in the long run, small companies can also see more benefits. But I was just thinking if there is a production point of view that affects these benefits or these results. And finally, to our colleague from the World Bank, I was not very sure if the figures that you show about the savings for the private sector is per year, or what's the time frame of these savings? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ecuador, for those questions and remarks. Any more questions before we start answering? Okay, no. One on Zoom, okay. Please present your name and the institution you're representing.
Thank you very much. Do you hear me?
We hear you loud and clear.
Yes, sorry, I don't see where to put the video, but it's okay. I'm from the European Commission, DG Trade. We are very pleased to hear a practical experience as well as researchers and the result of the studies on TFA implementation. Our experience on the ground would really be of the same vein as what the US delegation mentioned a few minutes ago, which is that on PSI, we are very much intrigued by the result because our experience is that it brings uncertainty. It is pretty complicated and it doesn't facilitate the business environment and the predictability of the rules. And we believe that controls at the border of the importing country with risk management and adequate measures are far more efficient. We are very much in favor of continuing the work and listening on the ground experience and as well on technical assistance and how developing countries and least developed countries manage or do not manage to get the necessary assistance to implement their commitments. So we are very grateful to the chair and to all the members for having organized this 5 years anniversary, which is very much welcomed. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, EU, for those remarks. Sylvia, you are ready?
I hope I am, and I'll try to be brief to not to eat too much of the time of the upcoming sessions.
Thank you very much.
But thank you very much for those very interesting questions, and I think they all relate in some sorts to each other, and then the comments as well made by the United States and the European Commission, and Ecuador's question on closing these gaps between regulatory frameworks and operational practices, because this is exactly what we are seeing with the indicators, that really this progress has been made and has been significant in setting up the regulations that are needed, the laws that are needed to facilitate trade, but much more needs to still be done to make sure that these cover the widest share of trade transaction and that they cover the processes of firms such as SMEs. And probably that there is a lot of scope for technical assistance to look closer at that, to listen more as well from the experiences of the private sector. And I think some very punctual technical tools have been mentioned, the pre-shipment inspection, but also pre-arrival clearance, risk management. And we're trying to track this. So if we know that, okay, there is pre-arrival, the possibility of having pre-arrival processing in place, but we try to also look, okay, what is the share of export and import transactions that is being covered right now, and try to also get that feedback from the private sector to see where are the pain points and what more could be done. So I think linking much better in the technical assistance capacity building programs, what is happening in putting the regulation in place, but also how it covers in practice transactions. I think that there is scope to do that and link better to the private sector as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sylvia. Will, a question for you, wasn't it?
Yep. Thank you. Just very quickly, the $210 billion per year and per year is the metric for the overall benefit to the private sector from the full and effective implementation of the trade facilitation agreement. That's kind of the research. At the national level, the other metrics relate to implementation of specific measures to date from the beginning of the TFA to the current point in time of implementation. So it's kind of different metrics, but all contributes to that 210 billion. Hope that answers things.
Thank you very much, Will, for a clear answer on that. That brings us to the end of this session. I'm sorry. I'm really sorry, Roberta. The floor is yours.
I thought it's important to clarify the issue of small versus large firms. Let me first say that our research does show that the trade facilitation agreement benefits all firms. Is that for some provisions we observe more benefit for large firms. And there are, and I think these results should be sort of pointing at the fact that that more needs to be done to make sure that the trade facilitation agreement that is designed to benefit all actually is also in practice more inclusive. One element is clearly, was Ecuador pointed out, is the fact that, for instance, some provisions related to the advantages driven by automation, for example, less likely to be captured by firms, small firms that, for instance, are not digitalized. But there are also other issues, and one of these issues that we raise in the work is that it could be even that the shipping industry and the lack of competition in the shipping industry, for example, is behind this sort of because some of the gains are actually captured by the shipping industry rather than the firms. And this is more likely to be the case for small firms than for large firms that have much more bargaining power. But of course, this more research will need to be undertaken on that. But I think somehow this point is that the fact that there is a sort of a puzzle to be filled, and these are elements of a puzzle that not many policies they interact, and to make sure to in a more comprehensive set of policies to make sure that gains are more inclusive.
Thank you very much, Roberta. Cosimo, you'd like to add something?
Yes, I would like to thank the representative of the EU Commission, DigiTrade, for their interesting remarks. And I would just like to confirm that we also find in our research that on average, pre-shipment inspections increase trade costs and thereby reduce bilateral trade flows by 5%.
Thank you very much, Cosimo. Well, this brings us to the end of this session, finally. And let's continue this discussion. We have many questions, we have many answers, and we like to share them. And please use the portal that has been created for this event to find out more. So thank you very much for all the speakers and to all of you for active engagement. I think we set a high tone for the rest of the day and hope you get most out of this anniversary event. So happy birthday, TFA. Thank you all.